Hello, Rambling Rector here. I thought I'd continue with my series of videos about things that I find fascinating. And one of the comments from a previous video was talking about the Telpiot site at which a number of ossuaries were discovered of various people. An ossuary being used as a place to keep the bones of somebody who's died. The process in Jewish circles was to allow the body to decompose, and the flesh would disappear, and only the bones would be left, and then the bones would be packed into a much smaller box, and then often those bones were kept separate. And it was the custom at the time that the name of the deceased would be inscribed on the outside of the stone box. It's important to remember two things, of course, about this. One is that you'd have to be pretty wealthy to be able to afford a stone box to be made for you. And the second is obviously that despite the best will, it was almost impossible to be able to corroborate the provenance of these boxes without some sort of independent record. So in the same way that we would, for example, look at, in a cemetery at the names on the graves, we would also be able to have a second reference to the people that are actually buried in those graves. And first century Palestine was not a place where there was a lot of primary or secondary sources on which to draw. But the Telpiot tomb is really interesting because there are a number of books written on the subject. There's lots of authors, Kathy Reich, James Tabor, and so on, have written on the subject and have looked at the discovery of these tombs and the names on them, including people like Matthew and Mary, and of course James, son of Joseph. Jesus, son of Joseph. And it's fascinating because a lot of people would see that as being proof that Christ, though he may have been executed by the Romans and placed in a tomb, subsequently did not rise from the dead and did not ascend to heaven, as the gospel accounts would have us believe, and that therefore that if Jesus had been placed into a tomb on his death and his body was allowed to decompose naturally, his bones would then have been put into an ossuary with his name on the outside, assuming a number of things, not least of which is obviously that he was in a position to be able to be, or for his family to be able to afford that kind of interment, rather than just leaving his bones to be collected with lots of other people as well. So it's an interesting idea. Of course, if it's true, then that would mean that both the resurrection and the ascension accounts in the gospel are a fabrication, and so it's really important for those who would like to see this as evidence of the non-divinity of Christ, and perhaps the false accounts in the Bible of Jesus rising from the dead and ascending to heaven. Now, if it is true, let's say, for example, that Jesus was executed, his body was taken to a tomb, and was then dealt with as per the customs of his people, and there was no resurrection and ascension, then that raises a big question about other claims in the Bible, and certainly the divinity of Christ, and certainly the salvific message of Christ. So it's quite an important deal to discuss. The flip of that is that if Telpiot and if the tombs and the ossuaries and so forth actually bear relations to other people of the same name, perhaps even within the same family, then it might be the case that these are not the people that we know of from the Gospels. So it might be any number of people called Mary, or any number of people called Jesus, son of Joseph, and I don't know, and I think it's impossible to tell whether or not that was a particularly common name. I would assume that it was fairly common, as it is in some places in the world now. And so therefore I don't think it's necessarily definitive. But what I would encourage you to do if you're interested in this subject is to perhaps read a little bit more widely and just think for yourself about the implications of it. For myself, I don't ascribe to any of this, not because I don't necessarily want to agree with it or I want my beliefs to be undermined, but because ultimately my faith is resting on the views expressed, my beliefs that are founded in the gospel, which is pretty much a contemporary account, and certainly the letters of Paul are almost contemporary. It would seem unlikely to me that so many people who subsequently attested to the events of the New Testament were able to manage a falsehood and were able to fake perhaps the resurrection or the ascension. It just seems to me to be much more straightforward to believe the biblical accounts and to accept that actually Jesus is risen, Jesus is Lord, and that the salvation promises of Christ are true and valid. And I'm not sure really that there's any way that I could empirically prove that, but then I don't think that necessarily that's the kind of evidence that would be required. And if we feel compelled to produce evidence, then I suspect that that probably suggests that there's some other deficit in our faith. It's also, I think, extremely unlikely, extremely difficult that we can corroborate very much at all around about this time, but the evidence that does exist, the corroborative evidence that does exist around the Gospels, around the life of Christ, is underlining the truth of what was said. We may find it difficult at one level to understand it, to perhaps fully appreciate it, but I don't think that there's really any compelling evidence to suggest that it's not true. It's just sometimes the truth is a little bit hard to get a head around. Amen. And God bless you. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and I hope to see you soon in another video.